Welcome, welcome. Good morning. Good lunchtime, I suppose, if you're on the West Coast, East Coast of the North America. Welcome to the end of your Wednesday. You've made it halfway through the week. If you're in the UK or in Europe, this is dead exciting. As usual, because we are kind of working across a few time zones, we always like to give it a minute or two for people to kind of come on board. Um, have a wee read of our slide. It's just going to sit there until we kick off. But if you don't mind popping your name and where you're at in the chat, that is always fun. We can see, I was going to say, like, who's come from furthest away, but I don't know where Zoom actually lives in cyberspace, so that's a bit of a tricky one. But yeah, feel free to pop your name in there, where you're at, and maybe some of your interests when it comes to our conversation today. I'm just going to let you know, as some people are coming in, the session's being recorded, but we're using a feature. I don't know if you've seen it before in Zoom, where it's only going to be the speakers that are spotlighted or being recorded. So feel free to keep your cameras back on and keep your cameras on. I always like it. You won't be being recorded unless you're me, unless you're Lisa Elford, Humera, or Gbemi. So don't worry about that at all. I think because time is always short with these types of things, um, if you've had a wee read of the slide and you've been able to kind of share who you are in the chat, Lisa Androulidakis, could you maybe move us on to the next slide and I can tell you about the session and the speakers that are here. I'm just going to welcome our speakers and our hosts. So you've got me. I'm a partner at Habitus UK, and I'm going to let you read why I am going to be one of the speakers today. You've got my good friend Gbemi from the Samaritans. She's the Evaluation and Impact Manager at Samaritans based here in the UK. And as Gbemi shares as part of the conversation, I'm sure for those of you who don't know what the Samaritans are outside of the UK, I'm sure you'll learn a wee bit about that. Then we've got Humera, another one of Habitus's guests. Humera is based in Calgary in Canada, and she's a DEI strategist at the United Way. And again, as part of the conversation, Humera, I'm sure lots of people outside of Canada would probably really like to understand a little bit about what the United Way is and your role. And then finally, co-hosting with me our conversation, we've got Lisa E, who's a principal at Habitus Canada. So she's my colleague with Habitus Collective in Canada. So that is who is going to be kind of leading our conversations, answering some of our questions today around our topic. Is it engagement or is it research, and why the heck that matters? So that's going to be where we're going to go. But you'll notice that as part of our cultural exchange, our Canadian offices always starts with a land acknowledgement. And you'll have read on the past slide why that is. So without further ado, Lisa Elford, I'll hand over to you to do our land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much, Callum. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm very excited to be here with you all. And as always, I'm very honored to offer this land acknowledgement to everybody who's joining us from around the world. Our commitment at Habitus is to always work in a good way, openly discussing ethics, consent, harm, questioning data ownership and research intentions. And we really value, these complementary worldviews and honoring the stories and the ideas of those who came before us. And as always, we seek to balance these different ways of knowledge, which is why I'm so happy that we're all here today as well, because I feel like we're kind of putting this into action. So much like the ideas and the knowledge, they cross boundaries, and today they're crossing international boundaries. We're working in different lands and in different territories, and we want to honor those who have fought for change and hold up equity for future generations. So with gratitude and respect, today I would like to acknowledge the land from which we work here in Southern Alberta, which is the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, including the Siksika, Piikani, Amskapi, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, the Iathka, Nakota, Wichistabi, and the First Nations, which also include the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Goodstoney First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation. The area I'm the area that I'm working from today is also homeland to the historic Northwest Métis and the Otipemisiwak Métis government nation, the Métis Nation of Battle River Territory, which includes Nose Hill Métis District 5 and Elbow Métis District 6. We also acknowledge all Indigenous people who have made Calgary their home, which is the area that I'm working from today. Thank you so much, Callum.
And thank you so much, Lisa. Okay. Um, I really appreciate that because I think I'm gonna give a little bit of insight from a UK perspective. We are we are the center of colonialism. I think we were the leading colonial folks around the world, and it's a practice that we know very little about. So I always really appreciate being able to learn a bit about that. And you would imagine we would know more about some of those practices in the UK, but we don't. And so that's why I really appreciate doing the cultural exchange piece. Um, Lisa, Angela Dakis, could you share kind of the overview of today? So we are going to um, share some of the questions that we heard from you, and we've categorized them a little bit. Basically, we're going to kind of go through 4 different ways to answer the question, which is engagement. Is it engagement or is it research? We're going to define both engagement and research, the 4 of us together. We're going to talk a little bit about methods later on. Then, of course, have a little bit of a conversation around, okay, what does this mean when it comes to lived experience and peer? And then finally, think a little bit more about kind of the community elements of this and how you build out networks. And then we'll open it up. And we're really excited to have a bit more of an open dialogue conversation. I know most of the people who have registered today, geez, there are a lot of smart people on this call at the moment. And let's share, ask each other, really indulge in questions and in answers that that we don't normally get to do with protected time like this. And then finally, I call it the foyer space or foyer, I think if you're in North America, which is kind of, if anyone's ever been to an in-person conference, it's that space outside of the meeting room where that's when you talk to one another. So we won't run off at the top of the hour. Feel free to kind of share and chat at the end of our session because this is about connections too. So um, let's kick off the conversation. Gbemi, Himara, Lisa, I am going to throw it out there first, and I am going to say what happens when you ask. Okay, we can't help it because everyone talks about AI all the time right now. If you were just simply to ask AI, what is the difference between community engagement and community research? It's going to spit you out an answer like these things always do. And it's going to say that community engagement is about building relationships, encouraging participation, and community research is to gather insights about community. So you're doing more gathering. It can be potentially a bit more extractive if it's research. And with engagement, you're building those communities and you're building connections to get the research. I don't want the conversation just to be over because okay, we've answered it now, like we're absolutely done. I want to kind of open that up a little bit more with all of us together. So I'm going to throw it out and I'm gonna ask Humera, beyond these really simple definitions, what do you think in the fundamental differences are between these kind of traditional ideas of research and community researches? Anything that you would add uh, to kind of open us up and to get us kind of started about these days?
Sure. Thanks, Callum, and hi, everyone. So from my perspective, I've been doing community research and community engagement for, I think, almost a decade now. So from my perspective, and without undermining or discounting the value of traditional research paradigms, I do feel that traditional methods tend to be a little bit more Western-centric, somewhat distant, and at times also rigid as well. We all know that in traditional research methods, we would follow a top-down approach where we already know the research questions, we know the methods, even we also know the target population that we want to research on. So it's a very fixed structure, and anything outside those parameters, we would usually just leave it out. However, the engagement, I feel that the engagement in this sort of model is very superficial and short term. So we do not really engage communities for a longer term, or we do not really focus on building relationships with communities. Whereas in contrast, community-led research, which I'm deeply passionate about, I find it very human-centered, because when I go into that space, I do not go into that space as an expert, but rather, as a learner as well. And then you focus on building relationships, which takes time, and then you work with the community to actually identify the issues that matters to them the most. So it can be a very slow process as well. It can take months, multiple conversations to even define the focus. But at the end of it, it's all rooted in trust and collaboration, right? So the core distinction for me, I would say it lies in the power dynamics and the kind of knowledge each approach generates. As I said earlier, traditional research is often very generalized, very, on a distant objective, whereas the community-led research, it values lived experiences, local context. Both have their place, but if you want research that drives real sustainable change, we need to make space for the voices of the people we are working them and not just study them from a distance. So yeah, thank you.
I was thinking, Gbemi, like, does it actually like I suppose the answer is going to be yes, so it's more about why. But like, does why does it matter? Like, I feel like there is gray space, but I think Hamari, you beautifully just answered that. Like there is gray. So why does the definition why does the differentiation matter?
I
I
think
think, sorry.
often, a lot of the time, I think a lot of organizations will kind of pat themselves on the back for doing the community engagement. And it's such a broad term. And, there's lots of different ways in which you can do it, and it can be very light touch. For example, here at Samaritans, we have a lived experience panel, which is really brilliant. And we're able to bring lots of different people to share their experiences. But what we do find sometimes is there might be a one-off survey and, there's limited follow-up. It doesn't build on perhaps some consensus from the same individuals feeding back on the same topic. But we could say, well, we've engaged, and you leave it there. So I think when you think about the community research aspect of it, we're not just listening to these insights, we're actually turning it into something that's more strategic, more long-term, and it stops those individuals from simply being bystanders, which I think engagement can sometimes feel like, oh, well, we asked you, did you like it, yes or no? And then you're done. But with the research, there is something about more interconnected working. So I think it's really important to understand when you are just consulting, you take that information and then you build it into your own research plans. That doesn't then, that's not then reflected back. I feel like that's kind of letting down the research. So yeah, it's really important to move on from just asking really simple questions and leaving it there, but actually taking it further.
I love Chris shared in the chat there, like, so more co-production in a community model, which is the future. I like Chris, I like the confidence in that. It is the future, but I feel like it's a future we have to work really hard to realize, which is why coming together like we do. Gbemi, you've just shared that story. Humara, I saw you came off mute there. I didn't know whether that was, you were like, I want to add something to what Gbemi was just saying before I hand over to Lisa.
It's good.
Okay, we're going to go into methods, I think. So we're like, okay, it's important. We've got some definitions. We can ask ChatGPT what the differences are. Gbemi's talked about how you live it. Humara's talking about why it's important. Lisa, over to you for method.
Yeah, and it's interesting, actually, Gbemi, I liked what you said about, like letting people down in the research when we kind of enter into that more surface level sort of engagement with folks. And I also think it's really interesting, this idea of like this, the person who's being researched as well as the bystander sort of effect. And I guess that's one of the questions I really have, is really like, how do we define data within research? How do we think about some of the more methods that sort of are quite starkly different from traditional research, but also, kind of push the boundaries of what we think about in terms of data. And I was thinking about some of the challenges and sort of the ethical considerations. And, when we're doing community research, we do a lot of community research, for example, at Habitus. And we're often having these conversations about where that line is between what is data and what is engagement. And I was thinking too, from our experience, when we think about how we go into community spaces, we have to think about these sort of ethical boundaries about the way we treat and engage with folks, so that we're clear and open and transparent about what is data and what is simply giving folks sort of input and ideas into ideas or into projects and things. So I guess one of the things that I was sort of thinking from your perspective, Humera, lived experience is increasingly becoming sort of recognized as a space where we do valuable not only data collection, but as a source of data as well. And I was wondering, you and I have talked about this already, but how do we sort of incorporate and sort of validate lived experience within the research projects that you've had experience with, or within community engagement experiences? And maybe talk a little bit more about sort of the ethical considerations, which we all know are sort of paramount to working with people who have lived experience and actively reflecting sort of their narratives.
I think you're on mute, Humera.
Sorry, I started answering the question. Okay. So I do believe that to truly integrate lived experience as data, we need to move away again from traditional Western-centered research methods. Instead, as I always say, that we need a more relationship-centered approach where we focus on building trust within those communities and stakeholders, because this is not just one-time data collection process. It's an ongoing dialogue where we are co-creating this research with those who are experiencing these issues firsthand. And one of the most effective ways to do that, or to understand what's truly happening on the ground, is through storytelling. So I work mostly with marginalized communities and racialized communities, and they love telling stories. And stories do bring, very local, culturally grounded perspectives that we cannot simply get from standard questionnaire or frameworks, because there is a natural flow to the storytelling. So without that, without integrating that piece into research or community-led research, there is a real risk of misinterpreting the very experiences that we are trying to capture. So lived experience expertise bring, I believe, very invaluable real-world insights to the research table, and they also ensure that the findings are not just technically correct, but they're also meaningful and relevant to the communities that we are studying. So when we are designing, usually when we design, I work with Habitus as well, when we design community, participatory action research projects, we would usually involve people with lived experience from the get-go, even when we are conceptualizing the research questions. And this is so that we can have co-researcher advisors who shape our thinking, and then they also guide our methods. And then they would help us to decide which questions to ask, or the way we should ask them, keeping in view the cultural sensitivities as well. So, and a lot of times we would not have just one person with lived experience, because not everybody experienced the same thing, or we would want diversity of experiences as well, which I find it's very critical, because not two stories are alike. So a more inclusive approach gives us a richer, more nuanced understanding of the issues at hand. So also when we involve people with lived experiences at the start, I believe that they also help us address the ethical implications of our research. I've had some lived experiences as well, and when I was involved in some traditional research methods as a participant, I did find myself being re-traumatized, because the way the questions was asked. So I think that needs to be considered when asking someone to share personal traumatic experience. And we want to make sure there was support systems are in place, and we want to make sure that we are not unintentionally re-traumatizing them by revisiting difficult moments. So when we have experts on lived experiences on board, they make us more thoughtful and intentional how we approach data collection and engagement. Also, informed consent, I know that is usually the method in all research. That has to be ongoing and fully transparent. I always say that we have to be very careful and sensitive when we're working with people with lived experience, and people should know, they need to know how their stories will be used, and they should also have the power to opt out or revise if they want to at any time. Again, confidentiality is very crucial when it comes to talking to people who experience marginalization or any sort of risk. Also, the issue of ownership, whose story it is and who gets to tell it. And I believe that community should have control over how their narratives are represented and shared. And just one last thing. Lived experience is also essential because people, they lived experiences, they also play a key role in contextualize findings. So those with lived experience help us interpret findings within a cultural framework that's meaningful to the community, ensuring that research is applicable and actionable. And even when it comes to evaluate the interventions. Lastly, I just want to say that involving people with lived experience throughout the research process, it's just not an ethical choice. It's basically a practical necessity, and it helps us create a research that is both empowering for the communities we work with, and also it's impactful in driving real change. And when we work with people with lived experiences, it requires a lot of humility, and because we're not just collecting data, we are being trusted with someone's reality. Thank you.
Thanks so
So
much.
like that,
And sorry if I spoke a lot.
I got overexcited, Lisa. And no, you did not speak a lot, Himara. I'm sorry. That was just such a lovely little nugget at the end there, and I couldn't help but share a little story dead quick, if that's okay, Lisa Alford. I think Simon, my good colleague and friend, is in the audience, and I think I'm gonna give you a shout out, Simon, because I think these things are values we find really important, and it's just fun to be around friends and peers, but practicing it is different, I feel like, and getting the help and support and not always getting this right. And the reason I mentioned Simon is he and I are doing community research with Lysandra Ladakis in the audience, Habitus in Scotland. And it is tricky sometimes to figure out, am I doing engagement right now in context setting, or am I doing the research? And you need a little bit of a team to figure that out sometimes, I think, because there are different ethical considerations when you are engaging, connecting, gaining context, building relationships, and then when you're in active research mode. And so I kind of want to share that with everyone, not to be like, we know how this is done and this is the exact manual and it's black and it's white. I would give one of those kind of recommendations to any of my friends here and any of you in the audience is having someone to bounce ideas off of. And luckily we have that in Habitus, and you have that as friends of Habitus, to be like, what am I doing right now? And can someone give me that perspective so I know the ethical considerations around the methods that are quite important. I've got a question. Oh, go for it, Lisa. And
Yeah,
then
no, I was just going to piggyback off that, Callum, because I do notice a lot of folks on this webinar today who have worked with us as people with lived experience on research projects, and they all have helped to inform, guide, and really vastly improve the work that we've done in those spaces. And yeah, I was just going to handball it over to Gbemi, if that's okay, because what I think was really great about what Humera was talking about was, outlining some of the challenges and the risks. But Gbemi, from your perspective, like how can we better ensure that the sort of concerns that were brought up are sort of addressed when we're doing these sort of less conventional sort of research methods, which I find very conventional because this is sort of the water that we swim in at Habitus. And yeah, like how do you sort of address these potential concerns, I guess, with community and research?
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, it can often feel frightening or concerning if you're not going to get the right answers, whatever they are. Often you might have a situation where decision makers are expecting to see particular figures and statistical significance and all of this kind of stuff, and that's because over time, from a societal perspective, that's what we've been told that is the right way to kind of interpret research, and that's what you're supposed to look out for. So if you're not a practicing, researcher, evaluator in the analytical field, then when these moves happen, you're not going to be aware. So I think there's something really important about taking those individuals, wherever the space is that you sit. So for example, for me within Samaritans, it's really important that I try my best to take those individuals in the organization on the journey with me. So when we are doing, novel approaches to things like we did with the online chat evaluation, which we recently completed with the amazing help from Habitus, we needed to really explain why we had chosen to go down this route and why this was important, and to really explain what we believe the benefits are going to be. And, ultimately, there is a really good product that they can actually see and say, yeah, this makes sense, this worked. And sometimes it's, hoping that there's that leap of faith to continue to do these types of methods. But I think also just being aware that sometimes these practices are new for individuals, and it's been open to the questioning and to really taking the time to explain and to have those sessions. And I would always, advocate for earlier engagement where possible with those individuals, and, being able to share, here's the plan, here's what we plan to do, here's what it's looking like so far. So they don't feel that, at the very end, here's everything. They feel like they are part of the journey. And I think that's been really helpful for us, because we're starting to hear certain language being used, or people are asking specific questions around the role of peer researchers in this particular project, because we haven't stopped going on about it, basically. So I think there's something there about continuing to advocate for that practice and taking people with you on the journey, so that everybody has that awareness and not just a few select people.
Is there anything you wanted to add, Lisa, before we move to our next?
No, go for it.
Yeah, I always think about Lisa, actually you help me a lot with this sometimes. It's this balance between giving the product to the power holders that they want, giving people what they ask for, and also trying to change the world at the same time is a really difficult. And Gbemi, I think you put that really beautifully. Like, yeah, people are on it. Everybody's on a learning journey, and even if you are a power holder, you still are on a learning journey. And so how do we take that and have the same expectations for you? And yeah, that is tricky to do, because I imagine we're all here because we feel that these types of methods are really critically important, but we've got to kind of work outside of our bubble to kind of do that. And I think, yeah, what you just said, Gbemi, often my experience has been the proof is in the pudding, but you've got to do a good job at creating the pudding in the end. Like, it's got to result in something that speaks to who you want it to speak to. And that can be done, Humara, to link it to what you've just said, like by making sure there's lived experience at the beginning and throughout, so it's done well. And also the stories are really rich so that lots of different people can kind of engage with it. Because I think I personally enjoy reading community research more than I enjoy often reading academic papers, or I suppose it depends on the author of the academic paper, but yeah, how we communicate our knowledge is critical. So my section, which I imagine if anybody knows me in the audience, is the thing I'm a passionate person, but this absolutely is my topic. It's all about lived experience and peer research, and particularly as a method. Humara, you spoke to it really well. Gbemi, you and I have just done a project around using peer research. And so maybe I'll put the question to you first, Gbemi, which is, having led kind of community research methods with incorporating that peer participation, can you share specific examples of the impact of actually embedding that peer research right from the beginning to the end? What kind of stood out for you in using that as a kind of a community research method?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, so many benefits. I feel really confident to 100% say that, the research wouldn't be as effective as it is in absence of the peer research. And for a couple of reasons, but I'll give you the two main things that kind of stand out for me. One is, in this particular project that we did, the peer researchers felt able to self-disclose at times. It wasn't, all of the time, and there was discussion in terms of boundaries and handling things in a sensitive way in terms of protecting their well-being. But one of the things they did do is to self-disclose at particular points during the different focus groups, which in turn allowed the participants to build that rapport with them, to develop a sort of kinship, and feel able to kind of share what it is that they wanted to share. And that would not necessarily have happened in absence of peer researchers. And we spoke a bit at the beginning about those traditional types of research where, it feels very boxed, and there's perhaps not always room for exploration, but there is something really important about ensuring your participants actually feel comfortable. They feel that they're in a safe space, and they feel that there are people there that they can actually connect with, so they can really share their actual experiences. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think Humera touched on this, which was around the actual contextualization of the findings. They were so central in making sure that the findings were actually grounded in reality, what actually plays out. I think often, you know, you can read something and decide that, okay, this is what it is, or this makes sense logically. But actually it doesn't accurately reflect the experience. So being able to have peer researchers who are able to really put it into context using their own experience, I think really strengthened what those insights actually meant, so they could actually go beneath the surface. I said I was going to mention two, but just one more, which I think is really important because it's also considering the wider impact. So yes, it's amazing that you might you know, deliver a great piece of work, but oftentimes we do things and they have knock-on effects, you know, in other areas that are perhaps not directly to do with our organizations. But a previous piece of work we did at Samaritans was with individuals with experience of being in prison, and this was a project that was exploring the role of the listener scheme in the prisons, in UK prisons. And actually, one of the reflections from one of the co-researchers was being able to work on this project and actually being able to work with the report writing, analysing the findings, is giving me experience that is actually really hard to find typically because of the stigma of having been in prison. So we're actually allowing individuals to also have that personal development of something that's really, really important, you know, rejoining the labour market and having something to show rather than being written off, which is how they described being felt. So I thought that was a really, you know, lovely thing to consider in terms of what it did for that individual, and kind of, you know, encouraging them like, yes, I'm doing this research, you know, I have these skills, rather than kind of being overlooked.
Yeah, I like music to my ears, Gbemi, right? Like it's you know, we get the results of the research you're trying to do for those decision makers, but you know, if done well, our candidates, you know, our peer researchers or those that are involved with lived experience, our community in the end, Mara, like you put it really well, the community we're a part of benefits from that participation. So you can think of it in two ways, right? You can think of it as a research you know, where you are drawing out intelligence, insights, and but you can also think of it almost from an intervention point of view. Participating in this builds your capacity. It is the hopefully the antithesis of the idea that research is always extractive. Like it does not need to be that way. People can build up as they go along. That would be my hope. And maybe it's a bit utopian, and I'd be happy for anyone to share in the chat. Callum, that is way too like utopia. That doesn't really exist in real life. I've got one more thought just about what you shared, Ben, and then I'm going to hand over to you, Humara. Is that I really like, I'm going to hold with it because I think we're going to get a question around that, which is this idea of mobilization of what you learn or sharing of what you learn, and how good the peers can, or peer research, our communities, put all the context with that data, because data alone doesn't always tell a story, but it absolutely can tell a story when we're actually using community research methods. And that's what can make us better community researchers, or better nonprofits, better health charities, institutions, anyone who's tracking what it is that they do, their impact, the change they're making. If we actually expand our thinking a little bit about community research methods, we can actually tell a much better story, which is really what we're doing in data a lot. So I think that's something we really need to consider and or think to an awful lot. So this kind of then ties then to maybe Callum's utopia, Humara, around, you know, all of this relies on trust. You know, all of this passion, hopefully I've kind of shared about community research and how it can be really, really good. And we are establishing connections, but I suppose like, how do you establish and maintain these relationships, this positivity with these community members, especially when they are, I suppose, they're being involved as participants, you know, throughout the journey? What practically do we need to be doing and thinking about to maintain that trust? Because it's hard earned, easily lost. And I think you talked to it quite well, Humara, is that we can do quite a lot of damage as well if we don't get it right. So any advice?
Again, Callum, like without trust, lived experiences or stories would never come to the surface. People, I always say that we need to make an active effort to reach out to the less, reach out to, and people would not come to the table that we if there is no trust. So for community research or community engagement, I would say that trust is central, and it's the foundation upon which we are building everything on, whether it's gathering data, identifying community needs, co-creating solutions, anything. But we also need to understand that it would not happen overnight. It's a process that needs to be intentional and consistent. And again, it's community engagement and research. I don't view them separately; they go side by side, and they have to be consistent. Though community engagement is definitely it's a broad term, but it's just not about coming in for a single project and then leaving. And if we treat engagement as something episodic, where we definitely run the risk of, the parachute in or a parachute out approach, where we might get short-term results, but then we would fail to build long-lasting relationships. And I strongly encourage everybody to read this article from Dr. Turin Chaudhary and his team at University of Calgary. I often, he's a great mentor when it comes to research and engagement. And basically, he's taught us how to do community engagement, which is like built over the years. And so for me, community engagement is ongoing because for me, this research is not just like it's not just about one research project. It's about creating a long-term commitment to the community. And we found that when we engage with communities over time, we built trust in a way that helps us move beyond superficial involvement and allows people to become active participant in the process itself. There's always buy-in, in that sense of ownership, that they somehow own the data, they own the stories, and then and when we are there, this ensures that the issues that we are exploring, those are relevant to them. It is not, we are not going there from an outsider approach, and we are not imposing our views on them. So from there, then they also participate in, the solution development and all of that. So at every stage of the process, the focus is on collaboration, and the more engaged and active the community members are, the more likely they are to trust the process. And trust is built when they see that their input is not only valued, but actually shapes the research direction, right? So this approach definitely then leads to more meaningful outcomes. I've seen that. I'm going to cite examples later as well, because then we know that it is the research that we're doing, it is reflecting the needs of the communities and the priorities that people want us to address. So for me, the key takeaway to build trust or working with community is to see that community engagement is just not one-time effort or a checkbox. It is a long-term relationship. And through consistent engagement, trust definitely deepens. People know you, they're familiar with the work, they know that, you're ethical, you're transparent, and then community members definitely, they feel empowered to take ownership of that process, and which eventually leads to more long-term and sustainable and real results that we intend to achieve. Yeah. Thanks.
Love that, Vimara. I wonder about making it really real, like as practitioners, and it's something I'm going to ask and answer my own question before I hand over to Lisa for the last section. So, the last question we had kind of pre-planned before. There's some great questions in the chat too. Was like, how do you define success in research that involves significant peer and community participation? And I thought about answering that, but feel free, Lisa, Mara, Gbemi, if you want to add anything more. But I really think about what you've just said, Humira, and how do we define success? Well, I think success is continued engagement with our communities and really good growing levels of trust. But I also don't want to discount. So it's really easy for all of us to be like, this is what you should do, without any acknowledgement of all of the things that are really make it almost impossible to actually do all of those things, right? Because funding is based on projects, whether or not that project is a year or two long. We've got our weekly rhythms and cycles that we need to report to our government agency or to our funder. We run a program and we have to watch the people go through the program. And so actually maintaining relationships to a community as practitioners of research is not easy. It's quite difficult, in fact. And so I think about like, what are actually things that we can do? I can share one story of my own, but if any of the three of you could think about, a practical story of your own of how have you done that, on top, when challenged with all of these systemic barriers. I was thinking like, I do my best to just at least stay friends or connected, or whether or not you want to use the language of friends, but hold on to relationships outside of a project, whether or not I continue to give the resources that I can give, whether that's financial or not. But maintaining relationships of some kind, whether that's the movement around lived experience and peer support, whether that's trying to connect that to other research work that I do in the future. So at least, I'm doing everything within my power to kind of think about how I'm adding to the capacities of the communities that I'm a part of. So, practically, Gbemi, for the project we've done together, I'm working again with the peer researchers and looking for opportunities for those peer researchers elsewhere. So, the project has come to an end. It's difficult to maintain that kind of community and connection to those folks directly, but the leaders, the nodes, I can think about opportunities and ways that I can continue to be connected with them kind of going forwards. But I don't know, Lisa, Humera, Gbemi, if you've got a really practical example that you could share with others, because it's easily said and not so easily done, right? I know that's outside of our questions.
Yeah, I'll just give a moment if Humera or Gbemi want to jump in. Callum, yeah, I mean, what's interesting, actually, I have loads of examples, but I'm also just aware of the time. And we want to use the last sort of 15 minutes, I guess, to kind of get through two big sections of the questions. And I guess even one of the things I was thinking about as you all were speaking was there are these kind of foundational pieces to good engagement and good research around like collaboration, trust, ownership. And the two kind of big sections that we want to sort of wrap up with as we kind of go back to our speakers here is around like, how do you use these, how is research going to strengthen these community spaces, but also then like, how do you turn findings into influence, which is, I think, a very critical question for everyone here today. And I was looking at the chat and I was noting how somebody was talking in there about how, even through participating in peer-led research, that they wouldn't have actually kind of known the things that they knew about themselves because they were able to kind of go through that full suite of the research process. And I think what's really interesting and powerful about that is it does speak to why this kind of engagement, why this kind of research really matters. And I just want to toss it back over to Humera as well. There was two kind of questions that we had here, and I think we've talked a lot about why we connect with engagement and like how it builds strong research. But maybe you could talk about how you ensure that research is responsive to community needs and priorities, rather than imposing sort of that external sort of agenda on the communities that we're engaging or researching with.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for this question. Again, going back to what I was saying before, how would you know what are the issues on the ground without being continuously engaged or involved in the communities, right? So again, I would say that genuine community engagement is more than just a method, it's a mindset. And I'm going to refer this to, again, the article that I was talking about, Dr. Tiran Chaudhry's. It was that this mindset is best understood through the concept of infinite versus finite games. So, which means that, finite games are those that have clear objectives, time frames, rules, where the goal is to win or lose. And we often think of many projects this way, set deadlines, deliverables, and goals, and then they come to an end. And a lot of research projects work like this. But for the community engagement, it isn't like that. It's more of an infinite game, and it does not have any definite end. It's about creating continuous evolving relationship with the communities we serve. And when we talk about infinite game, the goal isn't about winning or, concluding a project within a set time frame. The real objective is to ensure that the continuation of the game, to keep learning, growing, building trusting partnerships, relationships over time. And this engagement never stops. And the need for connection never stops. There's collaboration, there's shared learning, that's going on, that's ongoing. So this is where genuine community engagement plays a pivotal role in research. When we engage with communities from an infinite mindset, we are focusing on building trusting, collaborative relationships that are sustainable and flexible. And these relationships are foundations upon which meaningful research is built. So instead of just asking questions, as I said earlier, with the predetermined answers, we collaborate with community members as co-researchers who help shape the research questions, identify the problems, and then co-create the solution. And which, again, all we know when we do that, it's always more empowering, and then the research is always context specific. So for example, if you're talking about, let's say, I've done research on mental health, social inclusion, as well as domestic violence or other social issues. So we are not just collecting data, we are actually moving on. So we are learning from communities, we are adapting our approach as we go, and ensuring that as we go, our research evolve to meet their needs. So it's a lot of also back and forth process. And then this long-term relationship-centered approach is what allows us to produce research that just not effective at a single point in time, but it continues to have a lasting positive impact on the community. And now in Calgary, where we have more than 200 ethnic communities, so many languages spoken, there's complexity, increased complexity over the years that we've seen. We need that kind of research that's sort of ongoing. We are in the communities, we know people, we know the issues, and that's how we shape our research as we move forward. So just to end this, in short, by adopting an infinite mindset towards community engagement, we shift our focus from quick wins to sustained, meaningful change. And this philosophy doesn't build trust. It not only builds trust, but it also lays the groundwork for research that is not only more inclusive and representative, but also more likely to create a lasting impact. Thanks.
Thanks, Humera. And I loved it when we talked about coming on to this conversation. You introduced that idea of finite and infinite gain. And it's interesting the way it's kind of even framed the way I've been looking at projects in this last week and thinking about how when we approach communities, we do that with that infinite sort of gain approach. We're not just thinking about the 7 generations before us, we're thinking about the 7 generations that sort of come after us as well. We have so many questions around, how do we sort of build in these practical strategies for strengthening research in community spaces? But I feel like, Callum, those almost have to be a full webinar in themselves. And I really want to leave time to sort of delve in a little bit more into how we sort of bridge this into influence. One of the big things about the work that we started at Habitus was we really wanted to be able to understand how you can bridge good community research, good grounded knowledge into influence that makes positive changes, that really creates an impact. And so I thought maybe we can pass over to you and you can get through our next sort of batch of questions there.
Yeah, I think we're going to maybe go one. I've got basically 2, one for Gbemi, one for Mara, and then, yeah, there's some really great thoughts there. Simon, Lisa, Angela, Jack, you'd share some other questions. I really want to make sure we've got time for conversation. So last question, Gbemi. So if there's anything you really want to share, feel free to weave it into this this question. I think you've already spoken to it a little bit, but I think it's worth repeating when it comes to influence, which is this idea of like crafting narratives from our research data, dependent on who your audience is. How, in your experience, have you made your findings more relatable and meaningful to people who, either they're hyper kind of research and academic, or they're really not used to the jargon, because we create our own jargon in community research too. And so, any advice for folks when it comes to kind of creating those stories from our data, from this approach to research?
Yeah, lots of thoughts. I think being aware of your different audiences is extremely important. And this is something that holds with pretty much any type of research or conveying any kind of messaging to somebody who does not typically do that type of work. So it's about making these products really accessible so that the key messages can be extracted. Within Samaritans, I think something that's been really powerful that we've done, again, referring back to this online chat evaluation, is when we had the presentation to discuss the findings, the peer researchers were front and center, able to express what the research was telling us. And this is us not speaking for them, it's allowing them to discuss what they have found. And I think really hearing that direct perspective was very eye-opening for lots of the decision makers who are in the room and, you know, who might be from, say, the more operational teams. It was really important that they heard it directly from themselves. So it's not that we are saying this. And I think often it can feel like we're saying this is what you should do. And it's like, actually, I'm not saying that. These are the voices from the individuals that you said you wanted to know more about. And this is something else that we've done in our different publications. So, you know, hopefully this is going to be published in the next couple of weeks, but we did a research piece about self-harm in prison, and we had to be really careful to express, you know, this is what was coming from the people in prison that we spoke to. This is not us putting two and two together. And yes, that's important to be able to extract insights, but it's really important to be clear when it's coming from those individuals with lived experience, because again, you know, everyone has agendas. It depends on, you know, who you're speaking to, and it can feel like you're trying to lead people down a particular path, but actually to simply be able to say, this is what we heard, this is how it's been interpreted from the people who understand this, I think is so powerful and invaluable. And I think another thing we have to do is to be open to having questions asked and being a bit flexible in terms of understanding what communication is going to work best, especially with people that don't necessarily engage with this type of research on a regular basis. I think the online chat evaluation for some people will be the first time they've really ever seen anything like this. So, you know, being able to take the time to communicate, have those follow-up conversations. I think a lot of proactivity is also needed as well. It can be, you know, it can feel like a lot of time is needed, but I think this is the work that you put in now so that in the future, the same individuals that, you know, you are hunting down to have a meeting with to say, oh, can I share these findings with you, is now approaching you and saying, oh, what did you find out about this? Or like, can you tell me more about this? It's about building that curiosity. So just being aware of who your audiences are and how you can tailor those communications. And of course, where possible, I would always say, let the individuals speak for themselves, and so that we're not overshadowing.
Thanks so much, Gbemi. Really succinct. Sorry, Hamara, I'm going to ask you an enormous question, and then I'm going to ask you to answer in about 1 minute, if that's okay, so we can open up. No pressure whatsoever. Really quickly, we've talked a little bit about maybe specific audiences, but do you think there is a role, or what is the role in community research for that higher systems change, advocacy? You know, what is the place there, and do you think they make really good bedfellows, or they're the same, or they're quite different? That role for community research in systems advocacy and influence.
For sure, Callum. I don't know if I can answer it in 1 minute, but I'll try my best. So over the years, I have, I've been deeply involved in policy change and advocacy efforts, and I just totally love that work. And every time we've done that work, it has always started with research. And because we need that data, we need the evidence to work towards systems change. And when we talk about advocacy, it is definitely not just picking one issue, any issue at random, right? It's about being strategic. And there's so many problems in the communities, and unfortunately we cannot address them all, and it's just not feasible. So we would always I also I'm part of Calgary Alliance for the Common Good, where we actually start by organizing people, organizing the organizations around the most pressing issues that they are facing, and then we conduct listening campaigns, and where community members speak about the issues that affect them, and then we move on to the discernment, where we decide which issues we want to take on or we are capable of taking on. And at that point, research is very important, because research helps us guide this decision-making process. It provides the data, it provides, the necessary insights to make informed decision. So, and it is how we then start to think about solution, how we want to work with the community, all of that. So with research, particularly when it is community-led, it provides us with the empirical data to back up our advocacy efforts. And because it is just not opinions, it is just not anecdotal evidence, it's about gathering the facts that can challenge the established systems. And that is where I always say the power of data lies. So I just want to quote, this book here. I strongly encourage everybody to read it. It's Helena Worthen's book, What Did You Learn at Work Today? And, it always like struck me because she said that problems mostly begin at the bottom, right? And that's where they get shared, that's where they get debated and then passed upwards, negotiated, and eventually solved. And this bottom up approach is key in advocacy work. And so we start at the bottom level. These people have the knowledge, that knowledge which may not be coherently organized, it may be scattered or fragmented, but that's where the community research comes in, because then we can help bring that knowledge together in a meaningful way. And as researchers, as community development practitioners, our job is to help communities develop a shared understanding of their experiences, which I also, call consciousness raising, or, the building critical consciousness, which is essential for advocacy or policy change, because this knowledge is deep, it's emotionally potent, and it's shared and collective. And change. So when this comes together, communities can better organize, they can improve and fight for the issues that matter most to them. So I just want to say that, social change, it's a collective endeavor. It's embedded in a learning that is interactive and happens together, not in isolation. When people come together, they share their experiences, they organize for a change, then they create a momentum needs to push for policy and systemic shifts. So community research is crucial for advocacy and policy change, because it does provide the foundation for informed decision making and empower communities through shared knowledge. I just want to quickly take maybe 10 seconds to cite an example. So we were working on this private career college issue here in Calgary, and we started that work with research. So I was working with Momentum and other organizations in Calgary, where we started collecting data by talking to the students, talking to the teachers of the private career colleges and other stakeholders involved. And once we had the data, then we did the power analysis, we organized meetings with the ministers, we did a lot of advocacy for policy change. And finally, the minister has announced changes in the policy, that there will be changes in the oversight of these private career colleges. They've canceled some licenses as well. So there is a change that I have seen through over the past 3 years, just because of community research and, getting all this knowledge organized and then doing advocacy. So thanks.
Well, I love that.
Sorry, it was more than 1 minute.
That was an impossible task. I set you a completely impossible task. I think we're gonna get close to close out, but remember we have this foyer, so if you don't have to run off, feel free to share and kind of connect. All I want to do kind of before letting you kind of close us off, Lisa, is I suppose really quick reflections and just, well, I want to say are my thank yous. But this is why I like working at Habitus, because we've got the international perspectives, but I also I like meeting people like yourselves, our audience members, and just I really want to kind of repeat what you've just said, Humera. Like, this is fact, it is not opinion, because it is the experiences, and because we've got we've got the abilities and skills and know-how to ensure that validity of what is happening, and have the ability to ask the right questions, integrate lived experiences at all levels. And that's not just, I'm not saying Habitus, I'm saying us as people passionate about community research. It becomes valid as we combine the engagement, the wisdom of community, with then being able to kind of go out and do that research. If I bring us back to that question, I think we can thoroughly talk about it in a simple way. We can make it complex. We can understand how they both play off one another, which results in these really much more fruitful products of work and change. Ultimate change is the thing that I get excited about, like you've just described both so well. Over to you, Lisa.
Yeah, I just want to take like 30 seconds to say thank you to Humera and Gbemi for preparing so much for this conversation today. Like Callum said, it's an impossible task to get people to actually answer questions when they are so passionate about it and they have so much incredible experience that they're bringing to this. So the one thing that I'm sort of reflecting on is the need for more conversations like this one. So keep in touch with us. We will keep in touch with you as well. We'll send around all the resources that have been discussed in this conversation as well. And we hope to be able to organize another webinar coming up in the next little while. So watch this space and hopefully we can continue these conversations of learning. Thank you all for joining us today and spending some time with us, and have a lovely day. Stick around for the foyer if you like. We're happy to catch up with some old friends and new contacts that are coming on here. So yeah, we'll be here for the next little while.
Recording should end now as well. So if you don't want to be recorded,